My name's James and I paint minis. This is Spoon 37 Minis. Right, this is where you last saw the Goliaths. I just highlighted the grey pants, as you can see. Okay, so if you're anything like me, you're probably looking at these pants that have been highlighted and thinking that looks absolutely awful. So what can we do to fix that? So my solution is to take the two colours, the base colour uniform grey and the highlight colour ash grey, both from the Army Painter, and simply mix them together, which you'll see in a second on the palette. That makes a colour roughly between the two of them. It's not exact, but it is a 50-50 mix that I can hopefully paint in between the highlight and the base colour. So here I've got the brush loaded up with that colour, and the trick is obviously not to go over the edges, but just to paint beside each highlight and paint between the highlight and the base colour. It's fairly careful work, so you see me taking my time over this, but gradually what happens is those highlights become just a little softer and a little more blended. Sometimes you'll hear me talking about blending, and I don't usually mean a wet blend. I mean, I can do a wet blend if necessary, but quite often what I do is I paint colours, and if there is too big a gap between them, I will mix the two colours together and paint in between the two, and I call that blending. Now with some of these larger areas it's quite easy to just paint around the edges, and then with some of these creases it's a little more difficult because sometimes you have to paint just the thin end of the crease, but then you also have to paint kind of either side of it as well, because this is, unlike painting a two-dimensional thing, this is a three-dimensional object, so there is actually a sort of middle, top and bottom part to each crease. So you've got to take your time, but it's not actually that difficult to do once you've got the idea in mind. So you can see I can go along there, and then obviously I'm looking to do the creases as well. So that's underneath that one, and it's already starting to look a little bit better. Now some of these areas are a little bit hard to reach. For example, under the leg, I need to paint both sides really of the creases here, which includes getting into areas that are quite difficult to reach, and I just need to be careful not to get the side of the brush over the highlights I've already done. I just need the tip to go in and paint this slightly darker colour next to the lighter colour. Now hopefully you'll see what I mean about painting just the very tip of the crease, where this was actually the base colour, and now it actually looks a bit better already, and then I can paint beneath it as well, and then it will help complete this blending. Now there is another slight trick to doing this, in that if you feel any of the highlights have gone kind of outside their bounds, so you've highlighted too big an area, you can actually paint over it with this colour, because having mixed two pigments together, it is slightly more opaque than is normal for just using a single pigment by itself. And then what you find is you can then use that to block out any areas that are highlighted perhaps where they shouldn't be. So I did so at the top of the leg, where some of the highlights looked a little over the top, a little out of place. And then going back to these other ones where I just paint to the side of the highlights, but not covering the base colour and not covering the highlights. Having pretty much done this on the upper legs, the bit in between the bootstraps at the back actually now looks much more sharply highlighted compared to the rest, so you can see it has already toned it down quite a bit, and I just need to carefully poke the brush in here, hopefully not go over the edges too much. It doesn't matter too much because I'm planning to paint these bootstraps brown later on, but obviously there are bits that are already the sort of dry brush gunmetal colour over black that I want to leave that colour, and I don't want to go over the edges too much. And that concludes that one. And now, just to drive home the point, I'm also doing the same on the Goliath Gang boss, which has a much more open pose, and you can see, you know, it's got these kind of stark highlights, I suppose you'd call them, on the leg, where there's just kind of like, why have you graffitied all over the trousers? Well, you haven't. You've tried to highlight them, and it's been too big a step all at once. But here is a good example of painting either side of those creases, and within seconds, it's already toned down. It is still just as highlighted, but it's now a much smoother blend. And it doesn't matter somewhat if the painting either side starts to overlap. It'll just make the overall colour slightly lighter. Now, just as with the previous one that I showed, you have to paint above and below each crease, and then sometimes the tips of each crease as well, where you hadn't actually got the brush in with the full highlight because it didn't seem appropriate before. Whereas now with a slightly darker colour, it is much closer to the colour it should naturally be. And so here, I'm just actually kind of filling in the blanks, you know, anywhere that doesn't have a highlight at all, or seems to be over the top in terms of highlighting, gets this sort of intermediate grey colour. Now, one of the tricks here is there's a temptation to go all the way into the creases where you actually want it to be the darkest colour rather than this intermediate colour. So sometimes I am skipping a little bit where it could go to this blended colour, but just to keep the creases or the valley, I suppose you call it, as dark as possible at the bottom. So you only want this colour to be kind of halfway up the valley, if you will. Now, of course, this is also allowing me to smooth out those areas where I felt the highlights went into the right places, but it ended up just looking kind of messy or scratchy, like I didn't know what I was doing. Whereas this smooths it out and actually makes it look like rough fabric, but still, you know, highlighted and what have you in all the right places. Now again, having done the upper legs, we have to do this bit at the back between the bootstraps, which are previously just very, very thin lines. So you just basically paint left and right of each line, and if it makes the overall effect lighter, that doesn't matter too much, as long as the deepest recesses are still the uniform grey and the highest peaks are still ash grey, then this should work perfectly well. Right, that's pretty much done, and now I should have a picture of how it looks now, and you can compare that with earlier in the video where it was looking kind of excessively sharp, and now it's still highlighted and it still has the darkest recesses dark, but it no longer looks scratchy and awkward. Right, if you watched this far, first of all, thank you for watching. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. If you liked it, please hit like, hit subscribe, hit the little bell-shaped icon so you can get notifications about future videos. I hope they will be coming out soon.